What are some wholesome historical facts not taught in school? In 2006, while the Ivory Coast was in the midst of a civil war, the opposing sides agreed to a ceasefire so that they could all watch the World Cup. The break in fighting paved the way for a peace agreement a year later. Abraham Lincoln grew his famous beard because a little girl said he would look better with one. I mean, she was right. When the pharaoh Mentuhotep II's harem daughter died around 2050 BC, he mourned. She was only 5 years old. Her tomb, touchingly, was inscribed with the pet name Mite. This is translated to kitten. The candy bomber. After World War II ended and Berlin was divided, the UK and US dropped food into West Berlin by plane. One pilot, Gail Halvorsen, started to donate his candy rations to the children, and soon other pilots started doing the same. To let the children know that it was his plane, the one with the candy, they would wiggle the plane's wings before the drop. Word spread and more children would come, and it started a new PR campaign and started to change the mindset that Americans had of giving food aid to Europe. I always thought the story was really sweet. Halvorsen's still around too. He turns 100 this October 10th. It's taught in Ireland, but IDK about the US. When we had the potato famine, millions of Irish were dying, emigrating. And the Choctaw tribe heard of this, and despite being extremely poor managed to raise, I think, around $200. And now we've helped them out and raised $1.5 million to help them with COVID-19. About $6.5 thousand in today's money. There's also a monument in Cork called the Kindred Spirit that was built in honor of the tribes. Imagine that kind of togetherness on a worldwide scale. The F1 German Grand Prix. In 1976, after Niki Lauda crashed while hitting a barrier and catching a light, rival drivers Arturo Merzario, Guy Edwards, Harold Ertl and Brett Lunger all stopped their cars and ran to Lauda's aid. There are many such instances of this happening during the 50s right through the 80s, of championship drivers forfeiting a win to save a rival's life. And then he won his second championship the very next year. He also retired from driving, then came back, and won another championship 2 years later by half a point. After a crash like he had. Most drivers wouldn't be the same after that. Not Niki though. It just made him stronger. Rip Niki. During World War II, a German fighter pilot spotted a damaged American bomber, and rather than shooting it down, he decided to escort it to safety. Decades later, the two pilots found each other and became friends. Polish army had a goddamn bear fighting on their side in World War II. Edit. Sergeant watch at the bear. He's still on the regiment's coat of arms carrying an artillery shell. Ringo Starr once decided the Beatles didn't need him and decided to take a holiday with the intention of never coming back. When John, Paul and George found out, they went all the way to where he was staying just to convince him to come back. As I recall, he got sick of all the bickering during the recording of the White Album. So it's actually Paul playing the drums on the first few songs. When Ringo came back, his drum kit was all decked out with flowers. Pugs were bred by the Chinese to sit on the laps of emperors. They were, quite literally, designed to be lazy. I am pretty sure that's shit, so edit. I stand corrected. Both are from China. The official breed of the House of Orange was the pug. This is because Prince William was alerted to Spanish assassins by his loyal pug, Pompey. How's that for a backup fact? Pirate ships were, actually, pretty great. Relatively speaking, they were very democratic and pirate crews were pretty well cared for. Also, they took sexual assault against women very seriously. I.e., they killed you for it? WHO do, I believe. Sam Onello or a Reddit post off. Well, they don't seem to contradict each other. Living conditions fucking suck and you'll likely rot away below deck from some terrible disease while you lay in each other's piss, but hey, some democracy is pretty good, am I right guys? Also, pirates were really rare. The vast majority of seafaring raiders were privateers, which were basically mercenary ships who were hired by a country to attack the shipping of an enemy nation. There was a huge fight about African Americans using the public pool in Mr. Rogers' actual neighborhood, so he made an episode on his show where he and an African American guest were sharing a kiddie pool and talking about being nice to people even if they look or sound different. He taught a whole generation that racism isn't fair or right. During the filming of Gone with the Wind, 1939, on the Atlanta movie set, there was a long line of porta potties, each with a sign that said either white or colored. Lenny Bluth, in a fam extra, went to Clark Gable's dressing room and asked to speak to Hi Monsieur. Bluth showed Gable the toilets, and Gable immediately got on the phone, yelling at the director that if the signs were not taken down then they did not have Clark Gable as Rhett Butler, and seeing his filming was put off for 2 years to get Gable. That was one hell of a threat. Apparently, Gable even being accepting Bluth to enter his dressing room was considered a big thing, as Bluth was so low down the movie pecking order that he was not even going to be credited. Greater than Bluth was so low down the movie pecking order that he was not even going to be credited. I think if you told the people from that era who gets credits these days, their jaws would drop. You credit the people who served lunch? Quote, they deserve it, too. Doesn't matter how small the screw. The machine will eventually break if it is missing. Why should the big names be the only ones celebrated? And that's why I always stay for the credits and try to read as many names as I can. Everyone deserves to be acknowledged for their contributions. It's actually a crazier story than that. This episode was filmed shortly after angry white people poured acid in a motel pool that was being used by black families. The actor in the show was supposed to be police officer, and Rogers actually dried his feet. The entire show was a very gentle and very subtle and ultimately very profound way of saying fuck you to bigots. In the early late 1800s and early 1900s there were a few Supreme Court cases about the color of margarine. The dairy industry couldn't compete as well with margarine dyed the color of butter, so some states tried to pass laws saying margarine had to be pink, which the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional. However, they also decided that yellow margarine was defrauding the public, so for a while margarine was sold white with a packet of yellow dye that you could mix in at home. TLDR, they could believe it was not butter. I can't tell if this is wholesome or not, lol. During the Revolutionary War, a British general left his dog behind during a chaotic retreat. When the Continental Army found the lost dog, George Washington had a messenger go under a truce flag to return the dog to its owner. Not a single one of my history teachers told us about the Christmas truce in the First World War. Funny, every one of mine did, even the ones that never covered anything newer than the 1500s. My Balkanic friends have told me that the bitter combats of the wars after the breakup of Yugoslavia used to stop because both sides liked watching Mexican soap operas. Ah, Mexican soap operas. The true olive branch. The only reason the Pilgrims stopped at Plymouth Rock was they were running out of beer. They had to grow barley and hops. Based on Eric the Red's account, the first ritual done in the New World was when a German Balkan slave was found praising the berries identical to ones used for brewing in his homeland. After Commodore Perry forced the opening of Japan to foreign trade, Japan signed many unequal treaties with Western nations. 1888, Mexico signed the other treaty with Japan, but Mexico viewed Japan as an equal. The 1888 Mexican-Japanese Treaty was the first time a Western nation treated Japan as an equal. In the late 1930s, fascism was advancing through the world and no one dared to oppose it, except for Mexico. Mexico was the only country that openly protested against the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Italian and German involvement in the Spanish Civil War, along with the USSR, and finally, The German annexation of Austria. In Vienna we named the square Mexikoplatz, Mexico Square, in honor of Mexico being the only country that protested the Nazi annexation of Austria. Besides, during WW2, Qantas Airlines has never had a fatal commercial jet plane crash since its formation in 1921. And they give beautiful pajamas. On Christmas Day 1914, both of the sides of WW1 celebrated Christmas together with songs and games. This type of celebrations happened over the whole front in Belgium and France. The soldiers talked to each other like they weren't in war together. Many soldiers wrote in their diary that they didn't expected the enemy to be so kind and friendly, and that they wanted to meet with them when the war was over. But a few days later, the leaders of the armies found out about the celebrations and forbid any future meetings between the two sides. There were a few attempts to reconnect during Easter and Christmas, but the soldiers who attempted were punished or killed. The India-Pakistan border is one of the most disputed ones in the world, giving rise to the world-renowned hostilities between India and Pakistan. There was a time once a prominent Indian singer, namely Lata Mangeshkar, had gone to perform a concert for the soldiers there. As soon as the show began, Pakistani troops started firing rounds in the air, yelled obscenities and said, "We want to hear our voice too." So Indian forces turned up the speakers and pointed them towards the border. Pakistani forces returned the favor when prominent Pakistani singers came to perform for the Monsieur. I've heard that Indian and Pakistani soldiers get together to watch the India versus Pakistan cricket matches. There was a dog in WW1 that helped sniff out mustard gas named Sergeant Stubby. It's WW1, not WW2. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers who believed that the light of God shined in everyone, regardless of ethnicity or religion. They were known for treating the indigenous people relatively well and welcomed the first synagogue in North America in Philadelphia. That is true. They also created the basis for solitary confinement in prisons. So there are some drawbacks. History is nuanced. This is why I think hero worship in history is a bad idea. Until the invention of submarine warfare, it was widely considered an abominable war crime to sink a ship and not try to save its crew. Sinking civilian shipping was completely off limits if preparations were not made to rescue the entire civilian crew and transport them to safety at a port somewhere. It is still technically considered part of customary international law, but it wasn't enforced in WW1 or WW2 because both sides committed this war crime. Tu quoque, Latin meaning "you too," was a valid legal defense in war crimes trials. No Germans could be convicted of a war crime if they could show that the Allies had committed the same crime. An attempt was made to charge a German admiral for having a submarine attack merchant shipping and not save the drowning crew, but he was not convicted, because British and American naval forces had done the same thing. The question was wholesome history. I think they are saying naval warfare was wholesome in the part of history before this change. As I found out in the Hardcore History podcast on WW1, submarines started out by surfacing and announcing they were going to sink a supply ship in, allowing the crew to disembark to lifeboats. However, the British started putting guns on their merchant ships to fire back at submarines doing this, so it was a logical escalation to stop surfacing. War is pretty hellish. Also in WW2, a German U-boat captain tried to save the passengers and crew of a British ocean liner, which they sunk. The captain intended to take them to the nearest land, but was bombed by a US patrol plane. Even tough Red Crosses were put on the submarine. This was the reason why Karl Donitz forbade U-boats from helping the people they sunk. I was on vacation in Germany over spring break. They have these frog fences. These fences keep the frogs from crossing the roads and getting run over. At the end of the day, somebody comes by and gathers the frogs and helps them cross the road. Not only in Germany, and fences are not only to keep the frogs safe but also the drivers. So many frogs might pass a stretch of a road that it gets slippery from all the crushed frogs in. Somebody could get hurt. But where I live, they started installing blue reflectors to the road markers, and which are designed to warn wildlife, mostly deer, and keep them from running onto the roads. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day.